any of us, if we're caught at the right moment, could be susceptible.
I had this radical personality change. I dropped out of college, quit my job, donated my bank account. If they hadn't lied to me, I never would have gotten in the first place.
HBO's new sexually charged series, The Idol, puts cults front and center. In the show, Lily Rose Depp plays an often topless rising pop star who finds herself in the crosshairs of the leader of a modern-day cult played by The Weeknd. Now, The Idol is clearly a work of fiction, and according to critics, not a very good one, but the real-life nefarious dealings of cults have been splashed across the headlines for decades, and we can't look away. Just last week, Manson family member Leslie Van Houten was granted parole after more than 50 years. Leslie helped murder 2 innocent people under the direction of cult leader Charles Manson back in 1969. And last month, Lori Vallow was convicted of killing 3 people, including her own children, an act that prosecutors successfully proved to a jury was done because she believed the bizarre and extreme teachings of her cult leader husband, Chad Daybell. Waco, NXIVM, Jonestown, Heaven's Gate. There is something so fascinating and so foreign about cults. What did it take to convince Lori Vallow beyond the shadow of a doubt that her kids were zombies who needed to be murdered? Well, I turned to the experts to parse this out. What makes a cult a cult? And what does it take to brainwash someone into doing the unthinkable? Well, I was shocked to learn it doesn't take much. We are all susceptible to indoctrination. Now, at the risk of oversimplifying it, it comes down to this: the wrong person saying the right thing to someone at a bad time, and just like that, you're in. Here is how cult and destructive mind control expert and former cult member himself, Dr. Steven Hassan, explains it.
The public tends to think that only weak and stupid people or uneducated people or people from bad homes or not given religious upbringing get into these groups, but it's not the case. And the public needs to understand we're all human, and therefore we have life cycle events, death of a loved one, an illness, a breakup, a loss of a job, moving to a new city, state, or country. We have moments where we're going to be more open to strangers.
Modern-day cults come in all shapes and sizes. The term is very broad. Some of us may even be part of one at this very moment. Some people think that sports fanatics fit the bill. Mike King, a former cult investigator who's worked on more than 300 cult cases, says that there is an argument there to be made that it's true.
A professional football team, if you're a rabid fan, you could consider that being cultish in nature. And so the idea becomes, is it destructive in nature?
What is that special something that delineates it from other types of crimes?
But the common denominators really are splitting the difference between what is a destructive cult, something that takes people's will and subjects them to things, versus all the legitimate kinds of cults out there.
Cults and crimes are not mutually exclusive. Benign cults function above board, but destructive cults usually engage in some kind of illegal activity. In Mike's career, he often saw a lot of sexual and physical abuse and financial crimes like fraud in these types of destructive ones. But before we dive into what makes a destructive cult and how you can make sure you don't find yourself in one, let's try to understand the answer to this question. Why are cults formed to begin with?
Typically, power, money, and sex is the motivation and the control. It's not always sex, but it's often sex. But it's always power, and it's almost always money.
There are sex cults, religious cults, political cults. They're all a bit different, but they do typically share some commonalities, and knowing them is crucial.
But it comes to this destructive kind of leadership system that says, everything is required of you to give to the organization.
So there's a laundry list of characteristics that if the public understands this profile, and I have it up on my freedomofmind.com website, they can literally see the specifics, then you're going to protect yourself from 90% of every bad cult or controlling person that may want to be in a relationship with you. So that's always very important.
Dr. Hassan himself was a member of one of these destructive cults back in the 70s. He was indoctrinated by the Unification Church, who are known as the Moonies. Dr. Hassan was brainwashed into quitting school, giving every penny he had to the church, and cutting off communication completely with his family. He wasn't even allowed to read books or write or sleep for more than 3 or 4 hours a night. Sometimes days at a time he would go without sleep. Now, the Moonies followed one absolute leader who radicalized members into an extreme fascist group that believed democracy was the arm of Satan himself and that the apocalypse was coming in 1977. Spoiler alert, it didn't. Now, these weren't things that Dr. Hassan actually believed before he was indoctrinated, but he became a zealous believer. And how he was roped into this group is a textbook example of how cults recruit members.
My girlfriend dumped me abruptly and was lonely, and 3 women flirted with me and love bombed me at Queens College at the cafeteria, which led to an incremental recruitment and indoctrination into a front group of the Moon organization. And this is a group that believed Sun Myung Moon was the Lord of the universe.
The women essentially tricked him into joining. He asked point blank if this was a religious group, and they said no. He asked if they were students, and they said yes, they weren't. It wasn't until he was already being brainwashed that he learned the truth, and at that point, it was too late. Oftentimes, people who are feeling lost or lonely or seeking a place or a person to belong to find themselves ripe prey for cult leaders. Mike King was instrumental in bringing down the Zion Society cult. He even wrote a book about it. Their leader, Arvin Shreve, identified potential recruits similarly by targeting a vulnerability.
They are experts at finding people and the chink in people's armor that they can manipulate at that particular moment. For instance, in the Zion Society case, one of the things that Shreve found was most successful for him was he would look for young moms who had just gone through a divorce. They needed a place to stay. They were trying to figure out how they were going to pay their bills and feed their kids and do everything like that. And he would send his other women from the cult, because most of his cult was made up of women.
The Zion Society was a polygamous cult whose leader would take multiple wives, some as young as 4 years old. Thanks in no small part to Mike King's work, Shreve was ultimately caught and imprisoned for sex crimes. He died in 2009. The Moonies love-bombed Dr. Hassan. Zion Society went after single moms. NXIVM's Keith Raniere found followers through motivational courses, Chad Daybell through his books. This just illustrates that everyone needs something from someone at one time or another, and experts say it is dangerous to assume that you couldn't be manipulated.
Don't think you're invulnerable. Assume that everyone is vulnerable.
After an introduction is made into a cult, the process of indoctrination begins. Edgar Schein's 1961 book, Coercive Persuasion, describes this as unfreezing, changing, and refreezing. And here's how that works.
Disorienting a person, confusing a person, overloading them with information, making them question their sense of self or their commitment to their religion or to their country, for example, to disorient them. The changing is the indoctrination phase, where the new beliefs and ideology is put in. And then the refreezing is the new self that's superior to who the person was before. That's the programmed dissociative identity. And I definitely had that experience of the Mooney me versus the real me.
Now, Mike King explained it in even simpler terms using the myth of the boiling frog. If you toss a frog into boiling water, it's going to jump out and save itself because it perceives that immediate danger. But if you let a frog swim around in tepid waters, slowly ratcheting up the temperature, it will not notice the threat and allow itself to be boiled alive. Cult leaders brainwash their followers in the same way. They do it incrementally. And the manipulation continuously reinforces the cult's belief. Now, if you are like me, you're probably wondering how that actually works in practice. It seems odd to actually think about. Well, Dr. Hassan developed something he calls the BITE model of mind control, which illustrates the process. If you pull on all these levers at once, very delicately, you can brainwash a human being. Cult leaders use a variety of techniques to do this, from love bombing to sleep deprivation to flat out lies, while simultaneously disengaging followers from their friends and their family and their ability to do critical thinking.
And if people want to go out into the community, they can only go in pairs of 2 or more, where there's a protection system put in place to keep them from maybe talking to people that could lead them astray, or they're encouraged to separate from their families and their entire support system as part of this. And as they abandon that, then they start leaning more and more on the cult for providing that social network and that love and belonging and other kinds of things.
That separation creates this codependent hive mind under the control of the leader, and an us versus them mentality takes root. In his case, Dr. Hassan was convinced by the Moonies that his own family was satanic. Cutting ties with loved ones further isolates members from any external influences who may question the teachings of the cult. Remember the boiling frog analogy? Well, this process is going on so gradually, so delicately, that people don't even realize it's happening.
But it's not a matter of Chad and Lori Daybell saying, hey, we're going to start talking zombies and we're going to start executing people. It's they start out by saying, let's talk about preparedness and the fact that we're just a little more righteous than everybody else. And so they appeal to all these things, and slowly these people get indoctrinated.
Mike brings up another important factor in cult indoctrination. Here, Chad and Lori Daybell began by talking to those who would later become their followers about prepping for the apocalypse. Now, preppers are admittedly a fringe group, but their beliefs are more understandable by some than, say, zombie killings. This method is very common among cults. You lure people in with a common cause, something kind of regular, and then once they're in, you bring in the more disturbing aspects of the organization. And if you dare to think critically or think for yourself or question the cult's practices, there are consequences.
There's an interesting kind of a social event that seems to occur in the cults, because whenever someone starts to question, then they're kind of ostracized for a short period of time until they fall back in line.
With no other social group or family, because you've cut them out, you can kind of see why people would fall back in line to regain acceptance in the group. And cult leaders have absolute authorities. Blind obedience gets you favor with the leader, and dissent gets you punished and ostracized by both the leader and the followers.
Typically, cult leaders have very competent lieutenants who run the show, who actually will implement the actual policies and running of the cult. And it's amazing how many extraordinarily bright, talented people can be lied to and mind controlled. I'm a case in point.
This can lead to some pretty horrific practices in some cases, and particularly when the leaders manipulate their teachings to justify depraved and oftentimes criminal behavior. The leader of the Zion Society essentially concocted a new religion to rationalize sexually abusing women and young girls, children.
Many of the religious cults that I looked at, it was oftentimes the case that the leader would get revelation to justify whatever that perversion was. And it's interesting how his perversions just increased over time. First, he started out trying to legitimize it by having kind of a polygamous relationship of multiple wives. But then he determined that the women should start having relationships with each other. And when that wasn't enough, then he started introducing young girls into it.
Keith Raniere created a multi-level marketing scheme for self-improvement to lure in women and girls into becoming his literal sex slaves, which he is currently serving 120 years in prison for.
Does the cult leader themselves truly believe that it's what they're doing? Is their mind so perverted by their own message?
As a generalization, what happens is people who do this predatory behavior rationalize it, and they surround themselves with true believers who would never point out that this was evil or report the person to authorities because they're under mind control. Power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. And I'll furthermore say that most of these sexual deviant things, it's not about love, it's about power. It's about power over and using people.
Absolute power, absolute authority. It all comes down to the leader. A cult leader is typically a charismatic person, oftentimes a man who appears to have a preternatural ability to attract people to them. They have a certain magnetism, but it's more than that. Oftentimes, leaders will set themselves above their acolytes by claiming to have some sort of special power or unique, exclusive insight.
The cult leader profile is what I think Erich Fromm, who wrote in the 1940s, he described it as malignant narcissism, which is the grandiosity, the self-entitlement, the transactional. There's a set of criteria and lack of empathy. But the malignant part is thinking that you're above the law or the ends justify the means, pathological lying, sadism, paranoia, lack of trust.
Chad Daybell claimed to have a direct line to God, said he hung out with Jesus in past lives and was anointed by the Heavenly Father to lead the 144,000. That is a group promised in the Bible to survive and thrive in the apocalypse. In Waco, David Koresh was the head of the Davidians, clearly the height of hubris here, naming the cult after yourself, and he positioned himself unquestionably at the top of the hierarchy. Cult leaders can and will use this self-anointed divinity to control their followers and convince them to do things they wouldn't otherwise do in normal society.
They have to create something that says, okay, you might say it's against the law, but I can't offend God. Even if it breaks the law, I've got to do what God's telling me to, which is just such a bunch of malarkey.
These leaders often put themselves in a position as the Messiah, and then they use that position to stoke the fires of fear while telling their members that they alone can keep them safe. Marshall Applewhite and Bonnie Nettles, who are known among their group as Doe and T, believed life on earth was ending and the only way for salvation was through them. In their Heaven's Gate cult, these two controlled what members ate, what they wore, what they did, and managed to convince them that they had to take their own lives in order to ascend into space in their alien body to go to heaven. This actually culminated in the members committing ritual suicide. Of course, the most notorious of all cult leaders was Charles Manson, the head of the Manson family. He was a textbook cult leader. Manson collected a gaggle of devoted acolytes using mind control, fashioned himself as a prophet, and doled out messages from a higher power that only spoke to and through him. Under his leadership, the Manson family infamously murdered actress Sharon Tate and several others back in the 60s.
But it comes to this destructive kind of leadership system that says, everything is required of you to give to the organization. And oftentimes those leaders end up dictating everything.
Sex abuse, forced labor, murder. The destructive nature of certain cults is unimpeachable. And if the experts are right, and we're all at risk at some point or another, how do we ensure we remain in control of our own minds?
You need to do independent research on any person or group, and that if it's legitimate, it will stand up to scrutiny. The burden of proof is on the person or the group to prove they're good, not on you to disprove it. And when it comes to QAnon and all these alien theories and alien cults, it's like, I'll believe it, show me the evidence. Oh, just do the research. No, show me the evidence. Don't send me 50 YouTube links. Show me the evidence that's reality testable.
Interestingly, some of the former cult members who Mike King worked with over his career have gone on to join new cults. So, as Leslie Van Houten prepares to re-enter society half a century after joining the Manson family, and the weekend enthralls his acolytes in the idol, we'll be watching, because when it comes to cults, we cannot look away. For more true crime content like this, hit like and subscribe.